Welcome to Employees Diagnosed with Cancer, Current Perspectives and Future Directions from an Employer's Point of View. We're glad you're here. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, and I'll be co-moderating the webinar today. This webinar is co-hosted with cancerandwork.ca and is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Pain BC, SPOR Chronic Pain Network, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You will be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they're available. Dr. Christine Maheu and Maureen Parkinson will be moderating our Q&A session today, and I will let them introduce themselves and our presenters, Dr. Sietske Tamminga and PhD student Michiel Griedanus.
Well, thank you. So I'm Christine Maheu from Cancer and Work, and I'm an associate professor at the Ingram School of Nursing at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And my area of expertise is in cancer survivorship, developing psychosocial issues for complex interventions, such as for cancer and work and fear of cancer recurrence. And in my role as co-director of Cancer and Work with my colleague, Mrs. Maureen Parkinson, vocational rehab counselor from the BC Cancer, we have developed a website called Cancer and Work, which is the first and only bilingual French and English website designed to address cancer and work for Canadians. It contains 3 separate web pages to meet the specific needs of stakeholders, that is cancer survivors, healthcare providers, and employers. And it is grounded in the best available research and best practice from Canada and internationally on cancer and work. And cancerandwork.ca gives access to clear, extensive information on return to work nationally and internationally, including 400 pages of content, 28 topic areas, 8 online tools, and 7 videos. And the information and the resources from the website is designed to empower cancer survivors to be more successful, then enable healthcare providers to provide informed guidance and give employers the tools and the support to help cancer survivors at work. And now it's our pleasure to introduce our 2 distinguished speakers, Dr. Sietske Tamminga, who's an assistant professor at the Cornell Institute of Occupational Health of the Amsterdam UMC in the Netherlands. The focus of her research is on enhancing the return to work of cancer survivors by supporting the cancer survivor, the employer, or healthcare professional. She is involved in the supervision of PhD students and has been involved in the training of nurses on cancer and work. She's published many peer-reviewed scientific articles on cancer and work, as well as articles for lay audience. And she has obtained funding from others, such as the Dutch Cancer Society. Our second speaker is Michiel Griedanus, who is a PhD student at the Cornell Institute of Occupational Health at the Amsterdam UMC, located at AMC in the Netherlands. His PhD project is about the return to work of employees diagnosed with cancer, with a focus on the role of the employer. He developed an online intervention that supports employers during the return to work process of employees diagnosed with cancer. This online intervention consists of communication videos to the point of information and is easily accessible for employers. Additionally, he developed a new measure instrument that measures successful return to work. Michiel is also involved in the education of medical students. And now I'll hand over the floor to our guest.
Thank you, Maureen and Christine, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for the possibility to present our research during this webinar. First, I would like to introduce the group of researchers involved in this research project. They are from the University Medical Center in Amsterdam, from Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and from Belgium, from the University of Leuven. And the results we're going to present of the research that we have done have been financially supported by the Dutch Cancer Society. We are here right now in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, in Europe, and it is winter right now. So yes, we have been able to speed skate on the canals. And it is Friday evening. So when you are in this time zone, I hope you have a bag of popcorn with you and you feel very relaxed because it's almost weekend. But you might also be in the States and then it's Friday morning and I hope you have a cup of coffee or it's lunchtime and you have some other great food. You might also be on the other side of the world and then it's Friday night or Saturday early morning and you might need a cup of coffee. So wherever you are, I hope you will enjoy our webinar. I will start with a very brief introduction on cancer and work and the employer's point of view. And then using the return to work journey in case of cancer, we will give very practical tips and advices for employers, HR managers, case managers, and also for healthcare professionals in each phase. We will end with information sources and best practices that you can use in your daily practice in guiding cancer survivors back to work. When I tell people that I do research on cancer and work, many people ask me, why is it so different from another diagnosis? And I do think that there are a lot of similarities, but there are also a lot of differences. First of all, when people get diagnosed with cancer, they might feel very healthy before their doctor is telling them that they have a very serious illness. They might have a few symptoms, or they might go to a screening program, and then very suddenly the doctor is telling them that they have a very serious illness. The other thing is that around the diagnostic phase, there might be a lot of uncertainties. Extra diagnostics might be needed, and the treatment plan may also be not very clear at the beginning, because if additional treatment is needed, may depend on the outcome of the first treatment. And the last aspect is that when people do not feel very ill before their diagnosis, they might become very ill due to cancer treatment. For instance, they might suffer from fatigue, cognitive problems, sleep problems, and mental health problems. So that is, I think, very different when you compare a cancer diagnosis to other diagnoses. How this first phase of receiving a cancer diagnosis in relation to work is experienced is very well explained in this TED Talk. And that is why we're going to listen to the first 2 minutes of this TED Talk.
It was June 2014. I was 30 years old, and I received a call from my doctor's office to say my test results were in. So I walked up to see her in my lunch break, and my doctor said she was very sorry to tell me that I had breast cancer. I didn't want to believe her, and at first I didn't. You see, I'm a lawyer and I needed some evidence. So I'm very embarrassed to tell you all that I stood up and I walked around to where she was sitting so that I could look over her shoulder and verify what was written on the page in front of her. Malignant carcinoma. But still not wanting to believe it, I said, now, malignant carcinoma, you're sure that means cancer? She told me she was sure. Back at work, I handed over the urgent things that needed to be done while I was having more tests to see if my cancer had spread. But at that moment, work wasn't my priority. I was thinking about how I was going to tell my family and friends that I had cancer, how I was going to answer their questions about how bad it was and whether I was going to be okay when I didn't know that myself. I was wondering if my partner and I would ever have an opportunity to start a family. and I was figuring out how I was going to tell my mother, who had herself had breast cancer when she was pregnant with me. She would know how I was feeling and have an idea of what lay ahead for me, but I also didn't want her to have to relive her cancer experience. What I didn't appreciate at the time was that work was about to play a huge role in my treatment and recovery.
Unfortunately, Sarah is not the only one. If you look at the average number of new cases per year, you can see that a lot of them are in the working age population. And this number is going to increase, as in many countries the retirement age is going up. The survival rates are also increasing, and this means that the number of people who receive a diagnosis and are able to stay at work or return to work is increasing, so cancer will become more common in the workplace. With the increasing survival rates, there is more focus on quality of life, psychological and social outcomes, including the labor participation. I've interviewed over the years many cancer survivors, and they've given me various reasons why work was so important to them. For instance, they've told me that work gives structure, distraction, social interaction. It is an opportunity to contribute to the society, and for some, it gives them their much needed income. Today we will focus on the role of the employer, because the employer has been acknowledged as a key stakeholder in making it possible for a cancer survivor to return to work. An employer might be in the position to create work accommodations, such as a different work schedule, working from home, different tasks, different responsibilities. But unfortunately, the role of the employer has been understudied in the past 10 years when we studied cancer and work. So I do think we should focus more on the role of the employer in our research and practice.
Yeah, thanks Sietske for this introduction of the topic. So this webinar is about return to work of employees diagnosed with cancer. And we will present this return to work journey using 4 different return to work phases. And why would we do that? That is because we know that needs and preferences of several stakeholders are different throughout these 4 return to work phases. So we use these phases as a kind of a helpful framework for this webinar. I will introduce them shortly. The first return to work phase is disclosure. This is the moment that the employee discloses to the employer that he or she is being diagnosed with cancer. The second return to work phase is called treatment, and this is the period that the employee might be off work for a certain period. The third return to work phase is the phase that concrete plans and preparations for the return to work take place. And this does not include the actual return to work, because this is the 4th return to work phase. So this is the period of return to work and a certain follow-up period. And we stated that follow-up period on 6 months after a stable work situation is reached. And with stable work situation, refer to stable working hours and position at work. As you can see here in the picture, it seems that this return to work journey is quite straightforward, but that's not always the case in practice. In reality, it might be more complex. For example, an employee might want to plan the return to work, or sometimes even staying at work right at the moment of disclosure. Or some employees might need some additional treatments after he or she has already returned to work. So although it's complex in practice, we do use this, for this presentation, we present them consecutively. Starting with the first phase of disclosure. What we have to say here that not all employees disclose their diagnosis to the employer. And this might depend on several factors. For example, pre-cancer relationship between the employee and the employer, but also on local social security system. In the Netherlands, for example, we have a very protective social security system for employees on sick leave. So in the Netherlands, almost most of the employees tell their employer about their diagnosis. This disclosure is could be an emotional process, and as Sietske told us earlier, this is not only the case for the employee but also for the employer, because the employee is suddenly faced with a life-threatening disease, and this news is most of the time also completely unexpected for the employer. But I want to start off with the employee, because what we see in practice and also in research is that there are different types of experience among employees. And I highlighted some quotes from earlier studies. And the first one is, why me? Why should this happen to me? I can never work on my former, can I ever work on my former level again? And this is the type of experience that we call the emotional employee. This employee might be, it's very emotional, but could also be sad or even angry. The second one is the quote, we should not make it bigger than it is. I'm the same person as I was yesterday. And although this employee also regards the diagnosis as highly unpleasant, but this employee does not want to talk about it the whole day. As you can see in this quote, I'm the same person as I was yesterday, so maybe we can just focus on work or something else. The third type of experience is highlighted in the third quote. Other things are becoming more important for me. Work is not my top priority anymore. And for these employees, the diagnosis might be an eye-opener to, for example, spend more time with family and friends. In practice, this type of experience is not really common in the earlier phases of return to work, but more in the later phases. What is important here is that we do not judge on these types of experience. One type is not necessarily better than the other, but what is important to remember here is that there are different types of employees, different types of experiences among employees. Going back to the employer, what we see is, and this is in line with the previous slide, is that one of the biggest don'ts for employers is to completely guide the employee on the basis of previous experiences. I've heard an employer spoken to me said, well, I supported a certain employee back to work, and I did exactly the same thing on the next employee, and it just didn't work out. How is that possible? So what is the case here is that when you have different types of employees, then the return to work support does also have to be tailored. And one of the most common pitfalls is to just say to the employee, go home and come back when you feel ready. And although this might be said with the best intentions, this might be one of the worst start of the return to work process. So what would be a better start? Now, well, I would say not to make assumptions. Some employees might, for example, need emotional support in the beginning of the process, while others do not need this support. The tip that we give to employers is to ask the question, how are you doing? And when the employee is very short in his or her answer, then the employee might not need emotional support, while a longer answer might reflect the need for understanding, interest, etc. The same applies to preferences concerning work. We always advise employers to ask the employee, what is the role and importance of work in your life right now? And this is because some employees do want to work throughout treatment. And I think as an employer, you have to give the employee this opportunity. So work might be very important for some employees, even more after this diagnosis. So such a question might prevent misconceptions to occur. So what should a healthcare professional do in this first return to work phase? And I think the first thing is that you have to realize that the advice that you give to the employee influences actual return to work. So important here is that if you give the advice to go on sick leave for a certain period, that you have to realize that it might have financial consequences for the employee as well. We therefore also recommend to include the patient's work situation in the process of shared decision making. And we realize that this might not be possible for all cases, of course, or that it's not your priority as a healthcare professional, but realize that this might be a priority for the patient that is in front of you. That was the first return to work phase, and normally I would say, is everything clear? But if you have questions, please, you can tick them in the box and we can answer them later on at the end of this presentation. Then the second return to work phase, which is called treatment. As mentioned earlier, most employees do need some period off during treatment. Some might stay at work, but before going into more details, I would like to give the floor to Sarah again.
That it would be my co-workers and my job that would make me feel valuable and human at times when I would have otherwise felt like a statistic. That it would be my job that would give me routine and stability when I was dealing with so many difficult personal decisions and so much uncertainty, like what sort of breast reconstruction I was going to have. And at a time like that, you would think that I would turn to my family and friends for support. And yes, of course, I did that. But it would ultimately be my colleagues who would play a huge role in my day-to-day life. And they would be the ones to make me laugh. You see, we were a pretty close team and we shared a couple of really good in-jokes, like this time they overheard someone ask me how I got my hair so shiny and perfect, without knowing that it was, of course, a wig. And, you know, it was a very good wig and it did make getting ready in the mornings very easy. But in little moments like this, I appreciated what their support meant and I wondered what I would have done without that network. I've spoken with so many people, women in particular, who haven't had the chance to have that network because they haven't been given the opportunity to work through treatment. And there are several reasons for this, but I think it mostly comes down to overly paternalistic employers. These employers want you to go away and focus on yourself and come back when you're better. And they use those kinds of phrases. And while these responses are well-meaning, knowing the benefits have brought me, it makes me incredibly frustrated when people are told that they couldn't or shouldn't work when it's something that they want to do and physically can do.
I think her story is very inspiring, and it also underlines what I previously said about the different types of experiences. And I also have to address that her situation is also not typical for everyone, as some employees might want to focus on their treatment and do need some time off work. Then I would like to go on to a study that we conducted lately. We studied perspectives of both employees diagnosed with cancer and employers. And during treatment phase, both perspectives differed fairly. What we found in general was that employees found it very important that they had sufficient time off work during this period, and that they appreciated an employer who coped with the unpredictability of the disease. Employers, on the other hand, found it very important to to keep in close contact with the employee, and also found it very important to already make kind of a return to work plan. So what we concluded from this is that employers might be one step ahead during this return to work phase. Employers are already focused on returning to work, while the employee are not yet in that phase. These different perspectives might affect effective communication between both parties, both stakeholders, and what we therefore recommend is that both parties should have a kind of a mutual understanding of each other's perspective, and that is, I think, very important in this phase. Then some tips for employers or HR managers. Firstly, make sure that you pay attention to both work-related topics, but also to personal matters. Some employers might need more attention to personal matters than others, but keep in mind to stay interested in these personal matters as well. Secondly, what we found in practice and also in research is a certain wearing off effect from employers and from colleagues. In the beginning, employers are very interested in the employee situation, but as time goes on, this interest decreases. So please prevent this, as the employee might get the feeling that you don't want him or her back at work. And the third tip is that we already talked about that earlier, is that there are big differences between employees, but also within one employee there can be big differences. The effects of the chemotherapy, for example, are really unpredictable. So when making a plan for the next month or for the next week or maybe even for the next day, take this unpredictability into account. We also have an important tip or a do for healthcare professionals. A common pitfall would be that you say treatment first and then work. It would be better to discuss the possible harms and benefits of work during cancer treatment, as some employees might value work during or in this period. So be clear what the possible harms and benefits might be for the employee and discuss that with the employee.
Hi, here's Sietske again. When we go to the return to work planning phase, we will go to Sarah for the last time.
But while I was ready for all of the physical side effects, what really scared me was this thing called chemo brain. Chemo brain presents itself through memory loss, an inability to concentrate, and an inability to solve problems. And if this happened to me, I wondered how I was going to do my job as a lawyer. Would I be forced to leave work? And how could I possibly have a discussion with my manager about reasonable adjustments to my working arrangements when I didn't know how I was going to be impacted?
Well, Sarah explains that she feels very insecure about her work capabilities. We see that people who are off work for a certain period of time may feel very insecure about their work capabilities, but also there might be a new system, there might be new colleagues, their work might have been done temporarily by other colleagues who have done it very well. So all these things together, including uncertainties whether or not or how they will respond to chemotherapy or radiotherapy, might make people feel insecure. The other thing is that physical changes such as fatigue may be invisible, and that makes it very difficult for a supervisor or a colleague to provide emotional and practical support. Therefore, we do think that it is important to discuss gradual return to work with temporary work accommodations. And this gradual return to work should be flexible, because with fatigue, it might be that one day it will go fine, but the next day is not so very good day. And the other thing is that the last thing that you want is that someone is going to return to work, but going too fast. And then he or she has to go on full-time sick leave again. That is not good for someone's confidence. So if the plan is flexible, you can adjust while returning to work. And again, make no assumptions, but listen to the preferences and needs of an employee. For some experience types, they do not want to talk about cancer and their treatment on a daily basis. They don't just want to go to work to work and not to be a patient anymore. But others do need the emotional support. And again, offer work accommodations if possible. And if you do think that returning to work might harm the patient or a client or colleagues, consult specialized services. For healthcare professionals, we think it's important that there's coordination between the different stakeholders. But bear in mind the local regulations. For instance, in many European countries, a healthcare professional is not allowed to contact the employer or an occupational physician without consent of the cancer survivor. But if the cancer survivor provides this consent, I think it's important because an occupational physician can easier make a return to work plan or advise the employer how to make a return to work plan with information of the treatment and the possible side effects. If you see that a cancer survivor has difficulties with the side effects of cancer treatment, then referral to a rehabilitation program or a specialized occupational rehabilitation program might enhance their return to work. If you go to the last phase, the return to work phase, we see that employers tend to be relieved and see this phase as the last phase. Someone is able to return to work. But for an employee, it might be just the starting point. Because you often make a plan and you think it's a straight line until the finish. But in reality, there might be ups and downs and setbacks. And in case of cancer, we often see that after a long time, there is a wearing off effect of support and tension from family and friends, but also from colleagues. And cancer patients may feel like there is a black hole after treatment ended because they do not go to the hospital anymore so often, and people are demanding more of them. So actually, it might be a very difficult phase for an employee because he or she is going back to work and feel insecure about how that is going. So for employers, we advise to evaluate regularly, although someone has returned to work fully. Always show appreciation and still, if possible, because also when someone has returned to work completely, he or she might still be in need of adaptations and be aware of possible long-term effects to such fatigue. For healthcare professionals, we think it's important to discuss the cancer survivor's work situation at follow-up, and if there are still some long-term effects, refer to a rehabilitation program. To sum it all up, we think it's satisfactory and early communication prevents misconceptions. And we understand that it might be difficult for a supervisor to ask about or to talk about return to work when someone is just diagnosed with cancer. But we do think that you can always ask about the role of work in someone's life. And we think that assumptions are the biggest pitfall. So we all might have thoughts or feelings about cancer, or when you are a cancer survivor, when you should return to work or when you should not return to work. But I think we should always ask about a cancer survivor, him or herself, what he or she wants. The last thing is that we think that collaboration between employee, employer, and healthcare professional is a prerequisite for successful return to work.
All right, I would like to to end up with some information sources and best practices. Well, to the best of our knowledge, there are no evidence-based interventions for employers, but there are some very good websites that one could visit for more information. First of all, EOSHA, that's an European organization, finished a project about cancer at work and the role of the employer, and they developed a document which is online available with concrete tips, and also the tips are also per return to work phase. Here you can see a screenshot of this document, which is in English, but when you see the website that's below on this sheet, you can also see the document in other languages if you want to. Secondly, Macmillan is one of the well-known examples of work-related cancer support. This is a British organization, and they provide both online but also face-to-face support for employers and for employees. For non-British people watching this webinar, the online materials might be of interest, but the system in the UK might be different than in other countries. So take these differences also into account. So some tips might not be directly applicable for other countries. The third best practice is the Canadian Cancer at Work, and our co-hosts of the web are also co-directors of this organization. When you go to their website, you can find detailed information, both for cancer survivors, but also for healthcare providers and for employers, as you can see here. And if you're interested in cancer and work, I would highly recommend visiting their website. You can see more information, but also very practical tools for all of these stakeholders. Lastly, Sietske and I are working on the MOUSE project, of course, with some other colleagues. The aim of the project is to optimize successful return to work of employees diagnosed with cancer by supporting the employer. On the basis of several studies, and also in collaboration with multiple professionals in the field, we developed an online toolbox for employers. And this online toolbox includes easy accessible information for employers. And this information is also tailored per return to work phase. So as you can see here, if an employee is in the first phase with his or her employee, then you can click on this phase for specific tips for that phase, as you can see here. All tips are very short or brief or to the point. And if you want to see more information about the tips, then the employer can click on the certain tip, and then you can see also information or practical checklists, and also several interactive communication videos. And what is interactive about the communication videos? Well, the video includes some pitfalls for certain conversations, but also good conversations, and also conversations with different types of employees. So to sum it up, with the online toolbox, we want to provide the employers with very to-the-point information and tips in order to optimize their return to work support for employees diagnosed with cancer. And we're currently investigating this online toolbox in several studies, and the results will be available probably next year. All right, for the ones interested, the webinar was based to a big extent on these studies. So if you're interested, you can look them up on PubMed or Google Scholar. And this is actually what Sietske and I wanted to tell you about return to work of employees diagnosed with cancer. And I would like to end up with one of the most important lessons for all stakeholders in the return to work process. And this is a quote by Dalai Lama. When you talk, you are only repeating what you already know, but if you listen, you may learn something new. Thanks for your attention.
Hi, this is Maureen Parkinson. I'm the co-lead on cancer and work and a vocational rehab counselor at BC Cancer Agency. Thank you, Michiel and Sietske, for a great presentation. I appreciate that you're very involved with research, but you've kind of tailored this to provide some great concrete advice for healthcare providers and employers. So I'd like to open up the forum for questions for our attendees. So if they want to put their questions in the chat box, we can address your questions and put that to our guest speakers. So one question here is, are the strategies and tips favoring return to work implemented in the workplace? If yes, how successful are they?
Oh, we haven't done that research yet, so we don't know if a certain strategy is better than the other. We're currently investigating that, but I do think it's also tailor-made. So it's depending on the type of work someone is doing. It's depending on what kind of side effects someone is experiencing. So it is a very difficult question to give a very short answer to.
Okay, fair enough. So another question is, can you provide examples of support at work that have been helpful to sort of returning to work and remaining at work?
Well, yeah, I think that's kind of the same answer as Sietske told us. Since it's, yeah, I think the return to work support should be very tailored. So we do not have really examples of things that are effective for return to work or for a successful return to work. But I think one of the most important things here is to communicate with the employee. So that you can tailor as an employer, you can tailor the return to work support. So we do not know exactly, well, if you do this, then the return to work would be more successful. But I think communication is very important for this.
Right. So I noticed one of the things that you mentioned is that collegial support is really helpful. And I'm wondering, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes colleagues can be very resentful because they've had to fill in. So what would be a fill in for somebody while they're off and taking the burden of the workload? So I'm wondering what your advice would be to employers around encouraging collegial support.
Well, yeah, I think, well, first of all, as you are a supervisor, do not forget to pay attention to coworkers as well, because as you already mentioned, they might have to do all the extra work. So I think it's important to be very clear about why coworkers have to do extra work, for how long, how are you going to support them, and that you appreciate them. And actually what we forgot during this presentation is that we also advise employers to discuss with the employee how and to what extent coworkers are informed about the diagnosis and about the treatment plan. And some employees are very reluctant that their coworkers know about the diagnosis. But in my experience, if your coworkers know about the diagnosis and about the treatment and about the plan and when you're going back, they might be able to give you more support because they have the knowledge what is going on.
Mm-hmm. And somewhat related, we've got, thank you, a question where they're saying, is there suggestions around wording or a script for employees remaining at workplace while going through their cancer treatment who do not want to discuss their situation with their peers? Is there something that could be left to the manager to mitigate, or a script for the manager to address that?
I'm not sure what you're looking for. Are you looking for a kind of a practical conversation checklist or something for each return to work phase? Yeah, well, we that's kind of a big part of our online toolbox. We included for each phase a kind of a topic list. What we see there is that employers found that very helpful, but that there are a lot of topics on the topic list, and not every topic should necessarily be relevant for each employee. So yeah, there are topic lists. I'm not sure, are there a topic list on the Cancer and Work website as well?
Yeah, we do give some ideas about how to address disclosure. Yeah, in terms of the employee. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think and I guess that, like you say, communication with having the cancer survivor communicate with the employer about what they want to be said and to sort of talk it out so they can feel comfortable. And that can also include who's disclosing and what are they disclosing and when and how they're disclosing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that could be a kind of a guideline for these conversations. And I thought that Macmillan also has these kind of topic lists on their website. So that might be kind of a useful topic list. Mm-hmm. But yeah, for each conversation can be different, and for some conversations, some topics might be very relevant, and for others not. I think what is most important is that before the conversation, you have a kind of a goal for that conversation. So, for example, you talk about work-related issues, or you talk about personal matters, and then after the conversation, that you make a new appointment, and then you say, well, next week or next month we're gonna have a conversation again, and then the goal for this conversation is to talk about return to work or to talk about work accommodation, so that you have a goal together with your employee. I think that's important.
Right. And just related to Macmillan and Cancer Work, with Cancer and Work, when we developed it, we didn't want to replace what was done well, and the goal of that includes sort of offerings from Macmillan. So we do in our website, besides addressing the issue, if we think that there's some good resources, we link. So we have many links to the resources out there that are being done well done, such as Macmillan. Mm-hmm. So another question coming from me, and I hope it's not too challenging, but so I see many patients that report fear of stress, which they feel has caused their cancer, and they feel their biggest source of stress is work. And I'm wondering what your advice is for healthcare providers and employers related to that, because it certainly can be a big barrier for somebody. They can be very fearful about returning to work.
I do think it can be a big barrier for returning to work. But I would have, as a supervisor, I would have a conversation about what gives you energy and what causes you stress, and what can I do to support you to diminish the stress. Is it better for you to work from home? Can we do something about the workload or your work schedule? Or so what gives you energy and what gives you stress? I think that's that could be a very important conversation for a supervisor with an employee. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for a healthcare professional, I think it's more difficult. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but some people think that stress may cause a disease, and I think as a doctor you have to make that judgment whether or not the stress would harm the patient, and if not, and people still believe that stress causes harm, you could refer to a psychologist.
And if I may add here, is I think what Sietske said in the beginning is very important to make a very good plan for the return to work. So discuss with the employee, how do you want to return to work? Do you want the colleagues to be informed? Do you want the colleagues to come to you at your workplace and to ask how you're doing, or do you want your colleagues to, not to do differently than normal? So not talk about the diagnosis, not talk about the treatment, but just focus on work. I think if you make a very good plan on forehand, I think that might lower the stress for the employee as well.
Great. And somewhat related, you had mentioned about, like, if somebody was having difficulty to refer on rehab. What are your thoughts about early intervention rehab? Because I do think, like, psychological, like the feelings of stress, that there's a place of providing that earlier rather than later. So can you comment, even just in terms of accessing rehab services?
Yeah, I think it could benefit return to work. There was a study of a colleague of mine in the Netherlands, and she studied exercise during chemotherapy. and she found that enhances return to work. So when people start with like physical activities, the hypothesis is that they feel healthier and are better able to return to work as well. So I think that any rehab program might benefit return to work. But there is a big but, because it might take also time. So if it's a very intensive rehabilitation program from months after treatment, it might prolong return to work. But in the end, for sustainable return to work, it may still benefit.
Okay. So we have another question. To the best of your knowledge, do cancer survivors return to work have better quality life than those who don't return to work?
Yes, there's a research by a colleague of ours, Sietske Tamminga, and she found that cancer survivors who do return to work have better quality of life than cancer survivors who do not return to work.
Okay, that's good to know, and I think that's helpful to share with cancer survivors for sure. It seems that we're out of questions here. Thank you so much for presenting, and again, very much appreciate your practical advice. You were mentioning that you're going to have a workbook available, and that will be in, when do you think something like that will be available for?
Hopefully in 2020, so next year. We're currently conducting a couple of studies on the effectiveness of the online toolbox, and we're implementing the online toolbox. So it's really in the beginning, but we might have some results of that next year. So you will hear from us when it's ready.
Actually, I do have another question, and I think it comes up. What support can we provide for employers in order to help them, practical or otherwise?
What we found in our studies is that we do have a lot of information for the employer, and we might have enough information for the employers to fill a kind of a course of a day. But I think what is most important for employers is that they need the information right at the moment that they have an employee who is diagnosed with cancer, and they do need information that is really to the point, because I wouldn't say they're not interested in a course of a couple of hours, but I think you can reach more employers if you have really easy accessible information which is to the point and which fits in their practical day-to-day life, so to say. So I think make sure that you be there right at the moment that the employer needs the information, and to be very practical. So easy accessible information, and I think most of it should focus on communication with the employee. So practical tips, how to communicate with the employee, what can I ask the employee, how can I begin a conversation about work. These are very practical tips, and I think employers might benefit from these to the point tips.
So again, thank you so much, the both of you, for, and I really appreciate, I think the intent of this webinar series is to translate research into practice, so I really appreciate your efforts there. And yes, very interesting, and I see that you have your email addresses so people could reach out to you with your further questions.
Yeah, of course.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much for co-hosting this webinar and for giving us the opportunity to present our work and your work as well. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you so much, Sietske.
Sorry, this is Christine. I just want to thank you both as well. And also, perhaps I just want to know for the attendees, if they have specific questions they think about later today or during the week, I guess they can contact you directly in the emails that you have there on that slide.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, send us an email. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sietske, Michiel. Thank you for making the time to present our webinar today and sharing your valuable research with us. And also Christine and Maureen for beautifully moderating the webinar today. To our audience, thank you for joining us. We truly appreciate your support.